I also think there's this inherent link between classism and cleanliness and hygiene that people don't like talking about. Like I think on one hand, a lot of people have this understanding that our ancestors like didn't bathe or wash properly, but like I showed in Hinduism, in Islam, it's like baked into the text. Like you can't do certain acts without, oh God, without bathing. But then I think like for instance with Hinduism, I think it takes goes a step further, and that's how it like they kind of enforced like aspects of casteism, because those like Dalits for instance, um, lower caste Hindus, they weren't allowed to enter temples. So my father was telling me growing up, that even though Christians are without caste, they were kind of ushered into that understanding because actually, like, Christians would go into the Hindu temples to clean them, because Dalits couldn't do that. They couldn't even enter the temples. So this goes to my next point where, like, poverty and being poor is associated with dirtiness and lack of hygiene. And back then, compared to now, I mean, that's still kind of the same thing. Like the ability to like bathe regularly, is still associated, like to some degree, with having more money. And back then, that was even more true, because access to like good water was even harder to do on a worldwide scale. So back then, like hundreds of years ago, even in the 18th century, we're just going back a few hundred years, like rich people could just chill and sit in a bath. Um, but laborers couldn't do that. Like they didn't have the time or the energy probably, and they definitely didn't have the money to like do that regularly. And we now today have these understandings around like the lack of hygiene and diseases and things like that, like kind of like bubonic plague and et cetera, et cetera. So now we know that there's like benefits to having good hygiene, but I still think there's that link that, lack of hygiene means you're like poor and like uncouth. And that's why that person made that comment like, oh, we just have different, Indians just have different standards of hygiene compared to the West. And it's because the understanding there is that India is a poor country, so they're like dirty, poor people. Like, you know, that's how that comment came about.